The data packet arrived at 9:14 the morning, Galactic Standard Time, while Ambassador Yara Osei was listening to a Trell Merchant Guild representative complain about import tariffs on biological cargo. She read the subject line. She opened it. She closed it. She looked up at the Trell representative and nodded at something he said. The council chamber of the Galactic Cooperative was built to impress. 40-meter ceilings. Walls of pale stone quarried from a moon that no longer existed. Seats arranged in a perfect circle so that no species sat above another. A design choice that had taken 11 years of negotiation to agree upon, and which everyone secretly hated for different reasons. The air was kept at a compromised temperature that satisfied no one and gave 3 species mild headaches. Yara had sat in her chair at this table for 6 years. She knew which floor tile clicked when the Velhari delegate shifted his weight. She knew the Trell always arrived 9 minutes late. She knew the soft hum of the translation array when it was processing something with no clean equivalent in trade tongue. She knew all of it the way a surgeon knows a theater. Not fondly. Functionally. Her aide, Fen, was 23 years old, and still believed things happened for reasons that made sense. He was sitting 2 seats behind her. She did not look at him. If she looked at him, something in her face might move, and she could not afford that right now. The data packet contained footage. 17 settlements. The Veth had built their villages into the sides of mineral cliffs, which their biology preferred. They were small, photosensitive creatures, never more than waist height on a human, who spent their lives in the carved shadows of stone. They had no spaceflight, no weapons program, no seat at any galactic table. They had clay instruments they played at dawn and complex kinship structures that linguists had spent decades trying to map and never fully managed. They had been under Earth's informal cultural protection for 40 years, a quiet designation, never publicized. A line in an internal Earth diplomatic file that said, essentially, these ones are ours to watch over. The Karath Dominion had apparently not read that file, or had read it and decided it meant nothing. The footage was thorough, the kind of thorough that meant it was meant to be seen. A message, maybe, or simple administrative documentation. The Karath were bureaucratic in ways that made even humans look casual. They logged things. They dated things. They had file numbers on the operation. File numbers. Yara set her tablet face down on the table. The Trell representative was still talking. He had moved from import tariffs to storage regulations. The Velhari delegate was asking a clarifying question about the definition of biological cargo as distinct from agricultural cargo. The translation array hummed. She picked up her coffee. It was already cold. She put it back down without drinking. Her hand was completely still. That was the thing about Yara Osei that other species tended to notice eventually and never quite got comfortable with. Humans emoted, everyone knew that. The galaxy had centuries of data on human expressiveness. Their strange faces that moved constantly, the way they laughed too loud and cried at art, and touched each other for no functional reason. Humans were considered, in most diplomatic circles, to be almost exhaustingly warm. Yara was human. Her face right now was doing nothing. Not the nothing of shock. Not the nothing of suppression. The nothing of a person who had made a decision in the space between opening a file and closing it, and was now simply waiting for the appropriate moment to act on that decision. The session ran until midday. She sat through all of it. She voted on the import tariff motion in favor, because it was the right call on the merits, and nothing that had happened this morning changed the merits. She seconded a procedural amendment regarding meeting schedules for the next quarter. She answered 2 direct questions from the council chair, with the same measured, considered responses she always gave. At recess, she walked to the small antechamber reserved for Earth's delegation. Fen followed her in. He had not seen the packet. She had not told him. "Get me a secure line to Earth," she said. "Foreign Affairs, Director level." Not a message. A call. Fen looked at her. He was young, but he wasn't stupid. He had learned in 6 months working for her that she did not say times, not a message times, unless the message was the kind that couldn't wait for a reply. "Yes, Ambassador." He left. She stood at the window. The council complex was built on a platform above a pale ocean. The water was the color of old glass. A cargo transport moved slowly across the horizon, its running lights blinking in a sequence that meant it was operating in automated mode. No crew, just systems doing what systems did. She thought about clay instruments played at dawn. She thought about file numbers. The line connected. She recognized the director's face on the screen. A man named Haruki Sato, who was 60 years old and had the particular kind of tiredness that came not from lack of sleep, but from too many years of knowing exactly how things worked. She told him what was in the packet. She told him the number, 17 settlements. She told him the file numbers the Karath had used. Haruki was quiet for 4 seconds. "What do you need?" he said. "I need you to start pulling our people," she said. Not fast. Not loud. No announcements. Just start the process. Another pause. Shorter this time. "How many?" "All of them," she said. He understood. She saw it in the way his face settled, not into shock, not into the kind of grim, bureaucratic calculation she might have expected, into something older, something that recognized what she was describing without needing it spelled out. "It'll take time," he said. "I know," she said. "That's fine. We have time." She ended the call. She stood at the window a little longer. The cargo transport had moved off the horizon. The water was very still. Behind her, on the table, the tablet sat face down. Inside it, a data packet with a date stamp and a file number, and 17 settlements that had been built into the sides of cliffs by creatures who played clay instruments at dawn and had kinship structures. No linguist had ever fully mapped. She went back to the chamber. She sat in her chair. She did not drink her coffee. It was still cold at the end of the afternoon session. Still cold when she packed her things and nodded politely to the Velhari delegate and walked out. Fen fell into step beside her. He did not ask. She did not explain. The corridor stretched ahead of them, pale stone under pale light, and her footsteps made no sound at all. Nobody announced anything. That was the first thing other species would struggle to explain later, when they tried to piece together the timeline. There was no press statement. No emergency broadcast from Earth's diplomatic channels. No formal declaration of any kind. The Galactic Cooperative's news networks, which employed 600 journalists across 40 star systems and had broken every major story of the last century, missed it entirely. The second thing they would struggle to explain was how fast it happened. Not fast like a military strike. Fast like water finding a crack. Quiet. Natural. Inevitable. As if it had been planned for a long time, and only needed a single signal to begin. A human structural engineer named Davies finished his maintenance review of Relay Station Keth 7, filed his report, packed his tools, and left on the next transport out. The report was thorough. Everything was in order. He noted that his access credentials had been transferred to the Keth 7 automated management system, as per standard protocol. He did not note that the automated system had 312 dependency functions that had, until that morning, been quietly maintained by a secondary process that ran on Davies' personal authorization token. When Davies left, the secondary process stopped. Keth 7 kept running. For a while. On the other side of the cooperative's territory, a human woman named Dr. Priya Anand submitted her resignation from the Galactic Medical Coordination Board. She cited personal reasons. Her letter was polite. She gave 2 weeks, which was the professional standard. During those 2 weeks, she continued doing her job exactly as she always had, which meant that nothing changed on the surface, and everything changed underneath. Because Priya Anand had spent 11 years building the pharmaceutical cross-referencing system that allowed the board to coordinate drug interactions across 47 biochemically distinct species, and the system was tied to a licensing key that lived on her credentials. And when her credentials expired, the system would enter read-only mode, and in read-only mode it could not be updated, and without updates it would begin to drift. And when it drifted far enough, it would start producing interaction warnings that were simply wrong. She trained her replacement carefully. She documented everything she could document. She left the licensing key question out of the documentation. Not through malice. She simply did not volunteer it. Nobody asked. Nobody knew to ask. This was the thing about humans that the galaxy had never fully mapped, despite centuries of trying. It was easy to track human warships, easy to track human trade flows, diplomatic cables, political appointments. The cooperative had entire departments dedicated to modeling human strategic behavior, and those departments were well-funded and staffed with genuinely talented analysts. None of those analysts had ever been asked to map the maintenance contracts, the translation array technicians, the navigation beacon calibration teams, the conflict mediation observers who sat in on border disputes between minor species and said very little but whose presence somehow made agreements stick. The humans who ran the water reclamation systems on 3 deep space stations because the original contractors had gone bankrupt and Earth had quietly absorbed the work without anyone making a formal record of it. 40 years of showing up. 40 years of being reliable. 40 years of being the species that could always be counted on to fix the thing that was broken, the species that asked for very little and delivered very much, the species that had spread itself so quietly and so thoroughly through the infrastructure of galactic civilization that you could not see the shape of what they'd built until you watched it start to go away. A navigational beacon in Sector 12 began running a half-second lag on its timing pulse. Not enough to cause immediate problems, enough to cause eventual ones. A translation node covering 4 of the Kareth Dominion's diplomatic frequencies dropped 3 of those frequencies from its active queue. It kept 1, because Earth was precise about these things. It kept the 1 Karoth frequency that corresponded to distress signals. The Kareth ambassador to the cooperative, a figure named Veth Kara, who had worked this posting for 9 years and was considered by most of his colleagues to be competent and unexciting, tried to file a formal communiqué to 3 other Dominion embassies. The communiqué went through. The confirmations came back in the wrong format. The encryption handshake that had always worked without his needing to think about it suddenly required a manual override he did not have the code for. He put in a maintenance request. A human technician named Okafor arrived the next morning. Polite. Thorough. He ran diagnostics for 2 hours, apologized for the inconvenience, cited a software patch that had gone out overnight, said it would be resolved shortly. Vethkara thanked him. Okafor left. The encryption handshake did not resolve. Not that day. Not the next day. It resolved on the 7th day, briefly, for approximately 4 hours, and then stopped working again. Okafor filed a ticket. The ticket was assigned. Progress was slow. He was very sorry. He was, in fact, not sorry at all, but he was very convincing. Meanwhile, Fen, who was young and idealistic, and had figured out enough of what was happening to feel the weight of it pressing on his chest every morning when he woke up, stood outside Ambassador Osei's office and tried to decide if he should say something. He had done the math. He was good at math. He had looked at the withdrawal list, the real one, not the sanitized version that was being quietly distributed through Earth's diplomatic channels, and had run the numbers on what happened when all those people were gone. Not deaths, nothing so dramatic, just cascading failures. Small things. The kind of small things that, stacked high enough, made a civilization feel like the floor was dissolving. He knocked on her door. She looked up. "Are we going to war?" he asked. She considered the question. Not dismissively. The way she considered everything as if it deserved a precise answer. "No," she said. He waited. "Wars are for when you want to fight," she said. "This isn't that." He looked at her. She looked back, and for just a moment, one moment, the length of a breath, something moved in her face. Not grief. Not rage. Something older than both, that had been sitting quietly behind all that stillness for 6 years, waiting. "Close the door on your way out," she said. He closed the door. In the corridor, he stood very still for a moment, and tried to remember if he had ever, in 6 years of watching Ambassador Yara Osei work, ever felt afraid of her. He thought about the footage he still hadn't seen, but had read the summary of. He thought about 17 settlements. He thought about file numbers. He went back to his desk. He did not ask again. The emergency session was called on a Tuesday. By that point, 7-member species had filed operational disruption reports with the cooperative's administrative body. 3 deep space stations were running partial systems. The Velhari trade corridor had lost 2 navigational beacons and was operating on manual calculations, which their ships could handle, but their insurance underwriters were refusing to cover. The Trell Medical Exchange had begun throwing errors on cross-species drug interactions that nobody could trace to a root cause. The Kareth Dominion's diplomatic communications were running at roughly 40% capacity, which their ambassador had been complaining about for 6 days to anyone who would listen, and several people who would not. Nobody had connected any of it yet. That was, Yara understood, the precise point at which to let them. The chamber was full in a way it rarely was. Emergency sessions drew attendance, the way ordinary sessions never quite managed. There was something about the word times, emergency times, that reminded species that the cooperative was a thing they had built together and occasionally needed to pay attention to. 43 delegations. The full council chair, seated and ready. The air conditioning running 3 degrees colder than usual, which meant the building's automated systems were compensating for body heat, which meant everyone who mattered was in the room. Yara sat in her chair. Her coffee was hot this time. She had not touched it. The council president was a Velhari named Chauvel, who had held the position for 12 years and was, by most measures, genuinely good at it. She was not the kind of figure who performed authority. She simply had it, the way old buildings had it, through accumulated weight. She called the session to order and ran through the disruption reports with efficient precision, naming each incident, the species affected, the current operational status. She looked at Yara when she finished. "Ambassador Osei," she said. "Earth's maintenance personnel have withdrawn from 41 contracted positions in the last 9 days. We have been unable to reach a clear explanation from Earth's administrative offices. I am asking you directly." The chamber was very quiet. "Earth is restructuring its external service commitments," Yara said. "We have communicated this through the appropriate channels." "You have communicated it through low-priority administrative filings," Chauvel said, not angry, precise. "The effect has been significant operational disruption across multiple member species. That effect is what this session is about." "I understand," Yara said. "What does Earth require?" Chauvel said, "in order to restore those services." There it was. Yara had known it was coming, had known the exact shape of it, the assumption, reasonable and long established, that this was a negotiation, that there was a number, that Earth had decided its services were undervalued, its contributions under-recognized, and had manufactured a crisis to sit across a table from and extract concessions from. 40 years of reliability had earned them that assumption. 40 years of showing up had made them, in the cooperative's institutional memory, a species that wanted something in exchange for showing up. "Nothing," Yara said. Chauvel paused. "I don't understand." "From the council. Earth wants nothing from the council." Yara reached into the folder on the table in front of her and removed a single printed document. Printed, not filed electronically, because she wanted every delegation in this room to watch her put paper on a table. "I am tabling a formal declaration." She slid it to the center of the table. "The Kareth Dominion is no longer recognized by Earth as a sovereign entity under the frameworks of galactic law. As of 6 days ago, Earth considers Kareth-controlled space to be ungoverned territory. We will be acting accordingly." The chamber noise was not dramatic. It was the specific noise of 43 delegations processing something that did not fit any known category. "Low," murmured. The translation array worked harder than usual. The Kareth ambassador, Veth Kara, had been sitting in his seat with the careful stillness of someone who had spent a week knowing this was coming and had not managed to prepare for it anyway. He stood. "On what grounds," he said, "does Earth claim the authority to strip sovereign recognition from a cooperative member state?" "Earth doesn't claim authority over the Council's recognition," Yara said. "Earth's recognition is Earth's to extend or withdraw. We are withdrawing it. This is an act of aggression." It is a filing," Yara said. "The document is in order. The Council can note it or not note it. Either way, it reflects Earth's position." The Trell delegate leaned forward. Ambassador, if Earth is withdrawing services as a pressure mechanism against the Kareth, that is a matter for mediation. The Council has frameworks for exactly this kind of. Earth is not in a dispute with the Karath, Yara said. A dispute implies two parties with competing claims. Earth does not have a competing claim. Earth has a conclusion. The room again. That low, specific noise. Chauvel looked at the document. She had read it. Yara knew. Within seconds of it hitting the table, Velhari processed text faster than most species, and Chauvel was not average even for her kind. She looked up. The declaration references a reconciliation fleet, she said. Yes. Define reconciliation. Earth will be entering what we are now treating as ungoverned Karath space, Yara said. We will be searching for survivors of the Veth population. We will be recovering them. We will be documenting everything we find, and submitting that documentation to the Galactic Archive, regardless of Council approval. The silence that followed that was different. Heavier. The word times, Veth times, had landed differently than she had expected, or perhaps exactly as she had expected. There were species in this room who had heard of the Veth. There were species who had not. In the seconds after she said the word, she watched, without appearing to watch, as information moved around the table in the form of subtle glances and small physical adjustments. They were doing the math. All of them. And if the Kareth Dominion resists your fleet's entry? Chauvel asked. Yara picked up her coffee for the first time since sitting down. She looked at it. The steam had gone. It was lukewarm now, somewhere between what it had been and what it was becoming. She put it back on the table. Then we stopped being polite about it, she said. Nobody laughed. Nobody moved, for a moment that lasted longer than moments usually do in rooms full of 43 delegations and translation arrays and centuries of carefully negotiated compromise. Vethkara sat back down. Not in defeat, in the particular way of a person who had just realized that the room had changed shape and he had not been told. Chauvel's voice, when it came, was very measured. Ambassador Osei. This council would ask Earth to consider the precedent. The council's considerations are noted, Yara said. They have been noted for 9 days. She closed her folder. Outside the windows of the chamber, the pale ocean sat flat and still under a gray sky. No cargo transports on the horizon. No movement. Just water going all the way to the edge of the world, doing what water does. Waiting to find the next crack. The reconciliation fleet arrived at the edge of Karath space on a Wednesday. It was not what anyone had expected. The Cooperative's observation networks had been watching Earth's military deployments for decades. They had detailed records. They knew what a human war fleet looked like, the long carrier formations, the strike cruisers with their angular silhouettes, the logistics trains that stretched behind a combat deployment like a shadow that never quite fit the shape of the thing casting it. They had analysts who had written papers on human military doctrine. They had models. None of the models had produced this. 14 ships. 14. The Kareth Defense Command, watching the same feeds, initially thought it was a scouting formation, advance units for something larger coming behind. They waited. Nothing came behind. Just 14 vessels, moving in a loose formation that didn't correspond to any attack posture in any known tactical database, drifting into position at the edge of Kareth-controlled space, like they had nowhere in particular to be. Their classification was listed in Earth's own public registry as logistics and infrastructure, not warships. The Karath scrambled their defense fleet anyway. 43 vessels, proper warships, by any metric heavily armed, crewed by soldiers, running on doctrine that had served the Dominion in 3 border conflicts over the last century. They moved into intercept formation, broadcasting challenges on all standard frequencies, demanding identification and intent. The human fleet acknowledged, politely. The response identified the fleet commander as Admiral Ryo Tanaka, gave the ship's registry numbers, confirmed their classification as logistics vessels, and noted that they were operating within the legal parameters of Earth's declared non-recognition of Kareth sovereignty. The Kareth Defense Fleet held its position. The human fleet held its position. For 6 hours, nothing happened. Then the Karath Defense Fleet needed to resupply. This was not unusual. The scramble order had come fast, which meant some of the vessels had launched without completing their standard pre-deployment fuel loads. The fleet's nearest supply depot was Carith Station Durin, a mid-sized logistics platform that the Dominion had been running for 30 years, reliably, never an issue. Durin's docking control system ran a pre-authorization scan on the approaching vessels. The scan returned an error. The error cited an authentication conflict. Specifically, the scan had flagged an expired maintenance license on Durin's fuel transfer infrastructure. Expired, as it turned out, 11 days ago, when a human maintenance firm called Okafor and Associates, a small two-person operation that had held the license for 9 years, without anyone thinking much about it, had filed a routine license lapse notification, failed to renew. Without a valid maintenance license, Durin's automated systems classified its fuel transfer equipment as unserviced. Unserviced equipment could not be legally operated for military resupply under Karath's own regulations, which Earth had helpfully included as an appendix in a filing submitted to the cooperative 3 days ago. Durin's control system, following the rules it had always followed, locked the transfer systems. The Karath Defense Fleet contacted their command. Command contacted Durin. Durin explained the maintenance license issue. Command contacted their administrative offices to authorize emergency renewal. Administrative offices checked their systems and found that the renewal application process required a verification token from a third-party certification body. The certification body was a company called Galactic Infrastructure Standards Limited. Galactic Infrastructure Standards Limited had, 2 weeks ago, quietly notified its clients that it was suspending services in Karath-administered space, pending a review of its operational obligations under Earth's recent non-recognition declaration. The company's parent entity was registered in Wellington, New Zealand, Earth. 43 Karath warships floated in their own space, 2 hours from their nearest working fuel source, which was a civilian depot not rated for military resupply, and which would require a formal civilian requisition order that would take, under Karath law, 48 hours to process. The human fleet had not moved, had not fired, had not done anything that could be logged as an act of aggression. They were simply present. 14 logistics vessels in a loose formation, doing nothing at all. Admiral Tanaka sent a brief message to the Defense Fleet's commander, polite, as all human communications had been. It noted that Earth's ships would be proceeding to conduct their search operations, and that any interference would be interpreted as a hostile act against Earth's citizens operating in ungoverned territory. The Karath commander did not respond. The human fleet moved. They didn't go for military targets. They went for coordinates that had been calculated from the original data packet, the one with the file numbers cross-referenced against geological surveys that Earth had been quietly acquiring for 30 years under a cultural research program that the Karath had never once paid attention to. They went to the cliffs. Most of what they found was what they had expected to find. Ash. Silence. The specific silence of places that used to be loud. Stone that had been carved by small hands over generations, now holding nothing. Commander Naomi Torres, leading the ground teams, walked through 3 settlements without speaking. She was a methodical person. She documented everything. She had brought specialists for exactly this work: historians, forensic analysts, a cultural preservation team that had trained for 6 months on Veth language and material culture. They found the first survivors in the 4th settlement. A deep fissure in the cliff face. Natural. Narrow enough that a human couldn't fit through. Inside, according to the thermal scanner held by a corpsman named Adisa, there were heat signatures. Small ones. 11 of them. It took 4 hours to make contact. The Veth language specialists sat at the crack in the rock and spoke slowly, using the dawn greeting phrases that linguists had documented decades ago. They played a recording of clay instruments through a small speaker. They waited. A hand came out first, smaller than a child's hand in the way that all Veth hands were smaller than a child's hand. It touched the edge of the crack and pulled back, then came out again. Torres crouched down. She held out her own hand, palm up, waiting. 11 Veth. 7 children. 3 elders who moved like they had been still for a very long time. 1 young adult who had clearly been the one keeping the rest alive thin, in a way that said something specific about how she had managed it. A corpsman named Osei, no relation to the ambassador, though Torres would think about that coincidence, later wrapped a thermal blanket around the smallest child. The blanket was enormous on the creature, swamping it completely, only the top of its head visible. The child looked up at her with eyes that were adapted for cliff shadow wide, very dark, taking in the light of the open sky. It said something in trade tongue. Broken, the way a child speaks a learned language. Small pieces, imprecise, but clear enough. Are you gods? Osei looked at the child for a moment. She thought about how to answer that. She thought about 14 ships that had arrived without a single weapon fired. She thought about maintenance licenses and certification bodies, and the specific patience of a species that had spent 40 years showing up and building things, and saying nothing about what they were building. No, she said. She tucked the blanket tighter. She did not say what they were. The child leaned against her arm anyway. The thermal blanket crinkled. Somewhere behind them, Torres was recording coordinates, and Adisa was running medical assessments, and the cultural preservation team was beginning the slow work of writing down everything that could still be written down. The Kareth Defense Fleet, running low on fuel with 48 hours to wait for civilian resupply, turned around and went home. They did not interfere. Not a single shot. Anywhere. From anyone. 14 logistics vessels completed their work in ungoverned territory and began the return journey to human space, carrying 11 survivors and a documentation record that now occupied 300 terabytes of storage. Torres stood at the edge of the last settlement. The cliffs were quiet. The sky above was the pale yellow-gray of a sun that was close enough to warm but not close enough to burn. Veth's eyes, she understood now, were built for exactly this light. She stood there for a while. She did not document it. Some things were not for the record. Then she went back to the ship. The Karath Dominion lasted another 43 days, not because of anything Earth did directly. The fleet had come home. The maintenance licenses had not been renewed, but no new actions were taken. No ultimatums. No declarations. Earth filed its documentation with the Galactic Archive. All 300 terabytes of it, submitted the cultural preservation records, the forensic analyses, the survivor testimonies, and then went quiet. The Karath fell apart from the inside. It started with the military officers who had authorized the operation. Someone leaked the file numbers, the internal operation logs, the same ones that had been in the original data packet to a Karath domestic news network. The network published them. The publication triggered a political argument that the Dominion's government, which had been built on a specific kind of cohesion that did not handle arguments well, was not equipped to survive. 3 of the officers who had signed off on the operation resigned within a week. 2 were arrested by their own government, which then got into a dispute about what to charge them with, which turned into a dispute about whether the operation had been officially sanctioned, which opened a larger question about exactly who had given what orders and when. Nobody agreed. In the absence of agreement, the Dominion's governing council fractured into factions that had clearly been waiting for a reason. Trade partners who had been neutral began quietly reconsidering. Species who had business relationships with the Kareth found that their legal counsel was recommending they review the implications of operating in what Earth had classified as ungoverned territory. Banks that processed Karath financial transactions found themselves receiving polite but very detailed inquiries from Earth's Commerce Division about the definition of complicity. The inquiries were not threats. They were questions. Very specific, very thorough, very patient questions that implied, without stating, that the answers might eventually become relevant. Nobody wanted to find out how they became relevant. By the time the cooperative reconvened for its scheduled session, 6 weeks after the emergency meeting, the Kareth Dominion had 2 different governments claiming legitimacy, a military whose command structure had dissolved into competing fiefdoms, and a seat at the council table that had no one in it because the ambassador who had been sitting in it had resigned, and his replacement had not been confirmed because there was no confirmed government to confirm him. The empty chair was very visible. Yara looked at it once when she walked in. Then she sat in her own chair and did not look at it again. The session covered routine business first. Tariffs. Scheduling. A water rights dispute between 2 minor species in the outer sectors. Yara participated as she always did, Measured, precise, occasionally helpful. She had a long memory for the details of issues that seemed small, which meant she was often the person who caught the thing everyone else missed. And she had spent 6 years doing this work, without calling attention to the fact that she was doing it. She was doing it today, same as always. At the end of the agenda, under any other business, a delegate stood up. He was young. Very young for a cooperative delegate. His species had sent him as a junior observer, technically. But junior observers were allowed the floor, if no full delegate objected, and none had. He was from a species called the Orin, who lived on a chain of small ocean moons, in the outer arc of the cooperative's territory, and were not, by any measure, a significant galactic power. They had a small fleet, a small economy, a seat at the table they mostly used to watch. He had been watching for a while, apparently. "Ambassador Osei," he said. His trade tongue was careful, the way it is for people who learned it as adults rather than growing up inside it. "I have a question." "For the record." Yara looked at him. "Go ahead." "Earth has had the capability to do what it did," he said, "for a long time. Before this. For by my estimate at least 30 years. "That's not a question," Yara said. "No," he said. "The question is, why didn't you? Why wait? You had the infrastructure, the leverage. You could have used it decades ago." The chamber was quiet in the specific way it got when someone had said the thing everyone was thinking, but had agreed not to say. Yara sat with it for a moment. She looked at the junior delegate from the ocean moons, and thought about what answer he deserved. He was young. He had asked the question straight, without agenda, in a voice that was genuinely trying to understand something. He deserved a straight answer. "Because we were trying to be civilized," she said. The room stayed quiet. "There are rules here. Processes. Frameworks. Earth helped build a lot of them. We believed in them." She paused. "We gave them a fair shot." Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. The young delegate nodded slowly, as if he had understood something that he would need more time to fully know he had understood. Chauvel, sitting in the center chair, looked at Yara for a long moment. 12 years of running sessions had given the Velhari a face that was very good at not showing what it was doing. But Yara had been watching that face for 6 years. She thought she saw something in it. Not fear. Not disapproval. Something more complicated. The expression of someone who was recalculating a very long set of assumptions, and finding the math, came out different than she had expected. Chauvel called the session closed. People began to move. The sounds of a room ending its business chairs, tablet cases, the low murmur of delegates talking to their aides. Ordinary sounds, the kind that meant the day was continuing. Yara opened her folder and removed a single sheet of paper. It was a citizenship filing, standard form, which she had found in the archive because it had not been used in a very long time. Earth provisional citizenship, the kind extended in emergency circumstances to individuals of any species who found themselves without a recognized government or place of legal belonging. 11 names. Written in trade tongue transliteration, the Veth names converted into the alphabet of a form that had been designed for human names on a planet 400 light-years away. She signed it. Her signature was small and neat, and she did not make ceremony of it. Fen, sitting behind her, watched her put the pen down. He had been watching her for 6 years. He had seen her vote on 1,000 motions, and file 1,000 documents, and deliver 100 statements, and never once let anything she was carrying show on her face. She put the pen down and looked at the form for one moment. He saw it. Just one moment. The length of a breath. Something in her face that had no diplomatic category, that was not measured or strategic or restrained. Something that was simply a person looking at 11 names on a piece of paper. Then it was gone. She put the form in her outbox. She picked up her coffee hot this time, because she had learned, after a decade at this table, to time these things, and drank. Outside, the pale ocean was the same color it always was. The cargo transport on the horizon blinked its automated running lights. The platform hummed with the machinery of a civilization continuing to function, all its systems running, all its connections intact. Intact because the people who had built them had decided they should be. For now, the pen was old style, the kind with actual ink. The scratch it had made signing 11 names was still faintly visible on the next sheet in the folder. She closed the folder. She looked at the empty Kareth chair one more time. Just once. Then she looked away. She finished her coffee. The session was over.